If this story touched something quiet inside you, don't rush away. Sit with it, breathe with it, and if you feel the echo, laugh softly. Then share this with someone who might need to remember too, because joy grows when it's given, and maybe you are the fourth monk the world has been waiting for. Welcome to Zen Whispered Tales, where silence speaks and stories heal. Chapter 1, The Arrival. Laughter in a silent village. A quiet place where sorrow had grown roots, until three strangers walked in laughing. There was a village once, not marked on any map, not known for its wealth or its war. A small, sunburned cluster of homes surrounded by fields that no longer gave grain and streams that whispered more dust than water. The people here had forgotten joy. Not because they were cruel or bitter by choice, but because the years had worn them down slowly, like rain wearing down the edge of a stone. Not in a sudden storm, but in the long drought that follows it. Famine had come twice, the well had run dry once, and kindness, like water, had become something measured in spoonfuls and offered only in emergencies. Children were born into a world where smiles were rare and laughter was nearly mythical, spoken of in past tense like fireflies or festivals or fathers who didn't drink. They worked the fields, not for a harvest, but out of habit. Mothers sowed silently. Fathers stared at dry soil and said little. Even the dogs had learned to bark quietly. No music, no festivals, no singing in the night, no dancing under stars, only silence, thick, cracked silence and the low rustle of dust, until the day they arrived. It was morning when the first monk appeared, cresting the low hill that marked the village's southern edge. A man with skin bronzed by sun, head shaven clean and robes faded to soft orange from years of wear. He walked slowly, barefoot, his eyes squinting into the light, but his posture calm, like the still centre of a turning wheel. Behind him came two others. They were not identical, but carried the same air, simple, slow, serene. None of them carried bags or staffs or scrolls. They had nothing to sell, nothing to declare. They simply walked in silence. 3 orange notes moving across a canvas of beige. By the time they reached the centre of the village, a patch of dry earth circled by low homes and tired people, most of the villagers had stopped what they were doing, not out of interest, but out of confusion. No one came to their village anymore. So when 3 strangers arrived, unannounced, wearing robes and smiles, with no donkey or cart, no letter or coin, suspicion rose faster than curiosity. The 3 monks looked around, and then they began to laugh. It started like a ripple, soft, almost undetectable. A chuckle from the eldest, his eyes closed, his shoulders bouncing gently, as though someone had whispered a perfect secret into his soul. The second joined in, his laughter like a river, smooth and bubbling. The third, the youngest, laughed as if joy had found a new home in his lungs. His head tilted back, his arms loosened, his laugh rang out like a bell in a foggy temple. They laughed, not at anyone, not for any reason, they simply laughed. No words, no greeting, just laughter. The villagers stared, puzzled. Some frowned, others turned away. One man whispered, "Fools." A mother covered her child's ears. A boy whispered, "Are they mad?" But the monks didn't stop. They laughed as if the world itself was in on the joke, and they were just reminding everyone. They laughed with eyes glimmering and mouths wide open, not mocking, not manic, but completely free. And slowly, ever so slowly, the village changed. It began with a child. A small boy, no more than 5, who had never seen a juggler or heard a flute, tugged on his mother's sleeve and asked, "What are they doing?" "They're being ridiculous," she snapped, embarrassed. But the boy kept watching, and then he did something unexpected. He laughed, softly at first, then again and again. A high-pitched giggle, the kind that bubbles up without warning and can't be stopped. His laugh danced through the silence like wind through a windless room. One of the monks looked at him and laughed harder. Not louder, but deeper, fuller. His joy wrapped around the child's giggle like a warm blanket. Another child giggled, then another. Soon, someone's grandfather, who hadn't laughed since his wife died, shook his head and murmured, "This is foolish." And then a chuckle escaped his own lips, as if his mouth had remembered something his memory forgot. By mid-morning, the centre of the village was transformed, not by noise but by feeling. Laughter drifted like smoke from house to house, from doorway to rooftop, from kitchen to well. Old women smiled behind cracked lips. Men forgot to furrow their brows. Teenagers, who were usually too cool to feel anything, began to snicker behind their hands. A woman with grief-shaped shoulders sat by the fountain and wept, not because she was sad, but because her body didn't know how else to release the weight. The monks said nothing. They just laughed. Not constantly, but rhythmically, as if tuned to the pulse of joy itself. They didn't stay at an inn. They didn't ask for food. They curled up under a tree and let the sun keep them warm. By evening, the village had changed again. Fires were lit, not just for cooking, but for gathering. Old pots that hadn't seen stew in months were filled. Bread was broken, chickens chased children, a dog barked, and someone laughed at that too. The monks sat among them, still silent, still smiling. A girl approached one and asked, "Why do you laugh?" The monk looked at her and laughed again. She giggled. "That's not an answer." He pointed at her heart, then to his own, then at the sky. Then he shrugged and laughed. She understood nothing, but she couldn't stop smiling. As night wrapped itself around the village like a blanket, people sat outside longer than they had in years. No one talked about the drought, or the taxes, or the illnesses. Not because those things were gone, but because for the first time in a long time, they weren't heavy, and no one knew why. The monks simply laughed, then slept beneath the stars. And the village, for the first time in decades, dreamed in colour. The next morning, a rooster crowed, and people laughed at that too. It was as if the village had been coated in some invisible warmth, a layer of lightness that had nothing to do with weather, food, or luck. Just presence. The three monks woke under the fig tree without a yawn, brushed the dust from their robes, and stood in the centre of the square again. A boy had brought them a melon. A woman set down a bowl of rice. They said nothing, bowed in thanks, and laughed. The laughter was quieter today, softer, but somehow deeper. A group of elders approached. One cleared his throat and said, "We've decided to build a small shelter for you behind the temple ruins. It's not much, but you are welcome to stay." The monks only smiled. One of them reached out and touched the elder's shoulder. Then softly he began to chuckle. The elder chuckled back. A day later, the shelter stood complete. But the monks never used it. They preferred the open sky. They spent their days walking slowly through the village, pausing to laugh beneath the shade of a tree or on the edge of a well. Sometimes they stood completely still, eyes closed, as if listening to a joke told by the wind. Other times they laughed as they watched a goat chase a chicken, or when a child drew 3 stick figures and named them Laugh, Laugher, and Laughist. People started copying them without realizing it. Sitting a little longer under the trees, smiling at passing clouds, breathing more deeply, laughing, for no reason at all. And somehow in the simplicity of it, the village began to heal. On the 4th evening, a storm rolled over the distant hills. The sky darkened, heavy with clouds. The villagers grew quiet, nervous. Storms had not been kind to them in the past. Roofs had collapsed, crops drowned, children had fallen ill. The last time thunder cracked the air, they lost an entire field to rot. So when the first rumble came, many looked to the sky with dread. But the monks, they looked up and laughed. They tilted their faces to the wind, let the drops hit their cheeks, opened their arms as if greeting an old friend. As lightning cracked across the sky, they jumped and clapped like children surprised by fireworks. And slowly, one by one, the villagers stepped out of their homes. Not to fear the storm, but to dance in it. Bare feet on wet soil, hands raised, mouths open to catch raindrops. For the first time in years, the rain did not bring mourning, but music. Even old Yun, the blacksmith with a back curved like a hook, laughed so hard he nearly fell. His son caught him. Then they both laughed harder. That night, by the fire, someone finally asked the question everyone had been thinking. An elder woman, her hair grey like ash and her eyes as sharp as flint, approached the monks and said, "Why do you laugh, truly? We've heard no sermons, no chants, no teachings, just laughter. Is that all?" One of the monks opened his eyes slowly. He held up a single finger, then pointed it at the fire, then the sky, then at her, then himself, and laughed again. She furrowed her brow. You think life is a joke? He shook his head, then nodded, then laughed again. The people around the fire were silent for a long time. Then the old woman chuckled, and so did everyone else. That night, as the fire burned low and the monks sat in their usual triangle, backs against the earth, heads toward the stars, a whisper moved through the crowd. They're not laughing at life, they're laughing with it. They stayed for 7 days. On the 8th morning, they were gone. No goodbyes, no letters, no promise of return, just 3 impressions in the grass where they had slept. A child cried. But her mother said, "Shh, listen, they're still laughing." And in the soft wind that moved through the trees and the giggles of the children chasing chickens and the fire that crackled at dusk and the elder who now told jokes instead of complaints, they were right remained. The laughter remained. That night, someone painted 3 small circles on the village gate. No names, no words, just 3 orange dots side by side. The villagers passed it every day without speaking of it. But some would smile, some would pause, and some would let out a chuckle for no reason at all. "Maybe that's how joy works," said the girl who once asked the question. "Maybe it doesn't need to be explained. Just felt, just passed on." And from that day forward, the village was no longer silent. It wasn't noisy, it wasn't chaotic, but there was always something humming in the air. A breeze, a smile, a laugh, and every so often, when the wind blew just right, someone would say, "They're back." Chapter 2, The Villagers. Reflections in the Ordinary. Sometimes the greatest lessons are the ones that ask nothing of you. The village had not been built for beauty, but now somehow it looked beautiful. Not because the houses were painted or the roads were clean, not because new wells had been dug or old wounds suddenly healed, but because the people had begun to look at it differently. The same trees, the same paths, the same cracks in the walls, but under laughter's spell, they no longer looked like failures. They looked like stories, and stories are always beautiful, especially when they are finally heard. It had been 5 days since the 3 monks first arrived. 5 days of no sermons, no chants, no lectures. 5 days of simple presence, of spontaneous laughter, of being instead of preaching. And yet the villagers found themselves changing. They woke a little earlier, not out of necessity, but curiosity. They lingered longer at the well, not just to draw water, but to listen. They began to notice sounds they'd forgotten. Birdsong, wind chimes, the soft slosh of water in a clay jar. Life hadn't changed. But how they noticed it had. At first, people tried to understand the monks like a riddle. "Maybe it's a performance," one man said. "Maybe they're testing our patience," another muttered. "Maybe they're just mad," someone added. But over time, suspicion turned into something softer. Fascination. Maybe even reverence. Not because the monks demanded it, but because their silence never asked for anything but space. The villagers began mimicking them, not deliberately, but out of unconscious instinct. A woman who always rushed her chores began moving slower. A boy who used to shout started to hum. The village drunk began sitting outside the square instead of in it, watching them from the shadows, saying nothing. No one told him to do that. He simply began to listen. One morning, the monks stood in the square as usual. The sun rose like honey over the rooftops. The villagers gathered quietly. They were no longer coming to gawk, but to be near. That was when old Jun spoke. Jun, the shoemaker, the one who hadn't spoken more than a handful of words in a year. His wife had died, his hands had curled from arthritis, his shop had fallen to dust. He stood with a worn apron tied loosely around his waist and said in a voice cracked by disuse, "Yesterday, I found myself laughing because a frog jumped into my tea." People turned to him, wide-eyed. Jun nodded. "I was angry at first, but then I saw its face, and it looked so surprised, like it had just remembered it was a frog." The monks laughed softly, and Jun laughed with them. The villagers erupted in applause, not loud or showy, but like raindrops tapping gently on a roof. It wasn't about the frog, it was about Jun. He was back. Others followed. A woman who lost her child to fever told how she'd seen the monks gazing at the stars. She tried it. "I cried. then laughed, then cried again, she said. But when I stopped, I felt lighter. A teenage boy confessed he had tried copying one of the monks' gestures, standing still, looking at the wind, laughing at nothing. I felt stupid at first, he admitted, then peaceful, then like I was remembering something my body knew but my mind forgot. By the 6th day, the village had started its own kind of practice, though no one called it that. People began drawing small spirals in the dirt with their toes. They left small bundles of herbs or fruit by the tree where the monks slept, not as offerings but as thank yous. Children invented games where the winner was whoever could laugh the longest without saying a word. A group of women began braiding each other's hair again, just like they used to before the famine. Men who hadn't spoken to one another in years over land disputes began talking about the rain, and always the laughter lingered, not like thunder, like bells, soft, ringing somewhere far but near. On the 7th day, something unexpected happened. The monks did not appear in the square. They were not beneath their usual tree. They were not sitting by the well. They were not wandering the garden where a group of children had begun planting flowers the day before. They were simply gone. No one panicked. But there was a ripple, like the absence of music after a familiar tune. At first, some thought they had left quietly in the night, as they had come. A few searched the hills. A boy climbed the fig tree hoping to see orange robes along the winding trail, but there was nothing. Instead, the village did what it had not done for decades. It gathered. Not for mourning, not for ceremony, but for presence. The people came to the square anyway. They sat in a loose circle without being asked to. They said nothing at first. Then one man laughed. He didn't know why. Then a child laughed at the way the man's beard jiggled when he laughed. Then an old woman laughed at the child, and so it began again. They didn't know the monks were still there, in the forest just beyond the edge of the village, beneath the dense arms of a banyan tree. The 3 monks sat cross-legged, watching the morning unfold. They could hear the laughter. They could hear the wind passing through roofs. They could hear the world remembering itself. One of them smiled. Another tilted his head back and let out a long, low laugh. The third closed his eyes and whispered, "Now they don't need us." And that, to them, was the holiest sound of all. Meanwhile, back in the village, someone started a story. It was Jun again, the shoemaker now transformed. He said, "I remember something my wife told me before she died. She said, if you ever forget how to laugh, find someone who hasn't." He looked around the square. "I think we found 3. Heads nodded. Someone else added, "No, they found us." There was silence again, but not the dead kind, the full kind, the kind of silence that's not empty but alive, like the pause between notes in a song, like the moment between inhale and exhale. The villagers didn't speak much about the monks after that. They didn't build a shrine. They didn't write their names. They didn't declare a holiday. But they changed in ways that could not be undone. A month later, a traveller arrived, dusty, tired, cynical. He asked for directions. He asked for water. But he also asked, why does this village feel strange? A young girl, barefoot and smiling, looked at him and said, "Maybe because we remember how to laugh." The traveller blinked. "Who taught you that?" She pointed to the gate, where 3 orange dots still remained. And far, far away, under the shade of another tree in another town where the people were angry and tired, 3 monks stood silently. Then one of them began to laugh. One evening, under a moon so bright it seemed to breathe, a strange quiet fell over the village. Not the fearful quiet they once knew, but a sacred one. People sat on rooftops, leaned on fences, or stood barefoot in their doorways. No one had planned it, yet everyone was present. As if called, the square too held its own stillness. No monk stood there, but someone had drawn in the dirt a large spiral. It circled inward, wide at the edge, tightening toward the center like a breath being drawn slowly into the chest. And around this spiral, people began to gather. An old woman brought a bowl of jasmine petals. A child carried a flute made of hollow reed. A man who once never spoke unless drunk now held his daughter's hand. They walked around the spiral, some clockwise, some not in ritual, but in rhythm. not because they knew what it meant, but because it felt like something worth remembering. That night, by candlelight, a few women began to write small verses. Simple things. The sky is wide so my heart can breathe. If a goat can laugh, so can I. Some days you cry, some days the tears laugh too. They hung the papers on the fig tree, the one the monks had loved most. Children added drawings, stick monks, wind faces, stars with eyes. No one said this was a shrine, but everyone passed it in silence as if it was sacred. The next morning, two farmers fought. It was about a boundary, a worn rope that marked whose cabbage grew where. They shouted, loud like the old days. It was as if the laughter had been chased away. But then a little girl, watching from a corner, walked between them. She said nothing. She simply stood still, turned her face to the sun and began to laugh. Loud, unapologetically, completely sincere. Both farmers stopped, stared, blinking. One cracked a grin, the other burst out laughing. The girl ran away, giggling. The fight? Forgotten. Later that day, one of the villagers, May, a young widow who rarely spoke, gathered a few neighbours. She said she had an idea. What if, she whispered, we became the fourth monk? Everyone blinked. What do you mean? Asked June, the shoemaker. She smiled. They came, they laughed. They changed us, then they left. Maybe they were always meant to leave, but maybe they left someone behind. People exchanged glances. What if the fourth monk, she said, is not one person, but all of us, together? Someone laughed. Then another. Then everyone did, not because they understood, but because something inside them did. That night, they built a small bench beside the fig tree. Carved into the wood, it read, for the fourth monk stops laughing. They left it empty, except on days when someone needed to sit, or remember, or grieve, or laugh, sometimes all four. Years would pass, seasons would change, children would grow, houses would fall and be built again, but the laughter never truly left. It was in the soil, in the wind, in the way people paused before yelling, in the way they offered food without asking, in the way they looked each other in the eyes. Laughter had woven itself into the grain of the village, and it had started with 3 monks who never said a word. Whispered ending. You don't need to speak to change a life. You don't need a name to leave a legacy. You don't need permission to laugh. Sometimes you just need to begin and let the world meet itself in your joy. Chapter 3. The backstory. Who are these monks? The less we know, the more we feel. Some stories are told not in facts, but in echoes. The monks had left, but their absence didn't end the wandering. If anything, it invited more of it. Children began to ask, where did they come from? Elders began to muse, have they always existed? And in quiet corners the villagers told stories, not official, not agreed upon, but each held with equal weight. The first tale came from old Sori, the baker, whose fingers were always dusted in flour and who had known loss better than sleep. She said, I believe they were once kings, each one from a different land, but they gave up their thrones because they realised that the weight of crowns crushes laughter. In her version, the 3 monks met under a broken tree where lightning had struck all 3 of them in a dream. When they woke, they laughed, not because they were mad, but because they'd survived without bitterness. They left gold behind, she said, and took joy with them. No one questioned her because her eyes were too full of light. The second tale came from Jun, of course. His imagination had returned with his voice. He told the children, one was a thief, one was a soldier, one was a priest. Each had lost something precious. The thief had lost his hands to frost, the soldier had lost his leg in war, the priest had lost his faith to silence. They met in the ruins of a forgotten temple, sat there for days, staring at each other, refusing to speak, until one of them farted. The silence broke and the first laugh was born. They realised, Jun said, that life's deepest pain is also life's greatest joke, if you dare to see it. Others added their own myths. Others added their own myths. A woman claimed she saw the youngest monk in a dream as a boy, playing with tigers who laughed like humans. Another said the oldest monk used to be a cloud that fell to earth to remember how to touch soil. Children invented tales where the monks were once stars who had burned out but chosen to shine again on land. And no one argued, because somehow every version felt true, even the contradictory ones. But one story came not from a voice, but a drawing. It was found on the wall behind the old grain store 2 days after the monks had left. No one saw who drew it, but there it was, 3 figures standing in a circle, arms linked, heads tilted back, mouths open in laughter. Around them, a dozen small stick people, villagers watching, and from each villager's chest a wavy line extended toward the sky, like laughter, like breath, like prayer. Underneath, one word had been scratched in dirt-smudged charcoal: still here. Not all stories were spoken aloud. Some were written in the way people began to move. The blacksmith who once grunted through every day began humming while hammering. The weaver who used to sigh through her stitching now paused between threads to smile at the way the light danced across the fabric. And every gesture, every glance, every unspoken moment seemed to carry the signature of the monks. A calm, a softness, a reminder that even in this world, especially in this world, joy was not a luxury, it was a practice, a choice, a way of moving through pain without letting pain move through you. One boy, who had lost his father to sickness, began imitating the monks more deliberately. He shaved his head with a knife his uncle gave him. He wore orange robes made from cut curtains. He sat beneath the fig tree for hours without speaking. When asked why, he simply said, "I'm training. Someday I'll walk too. Laugh in places that have forgotten how." No one laughed at him. In fact, one mother brought him water each morning. Another offered him a biscuit. A carpenter made him a small walking stick, carved with 3 dots near the handle. It became his sacred game. Everywhere he walked in the village, he practiced. One breath, one laugh, one silence. And then came the story that no one wanted to believe, yet no one could forget. It was whispered in the wind one evening by Lean, the midwife. She said the monks had once been ordinary men, just like anyone else. But they had each lived through a heartbreak so total, it had erased who they thought they were. One had lost a wife to fire, one had lost a child to war, one had lost himself to his own cruelty. They each wandered, separately, silently, until one day they met on a road they did not know they were travelling together. For days they sat without words, because grief had stolen their language. But on the 4th morning, one of them saw the way the other was trying to catch falling dew with a spoon, missing every time. It was absurd, pointless, beautiful. And so he laughed, not politely, not cruelly. He laughed the kind of laugh that breaks open the shell around a person's spirit. And the others followed, and for the first time since they lost everything, they felt whole. Whether they were kings or clouds, broken men or ancient stars, no one could truly say, and no one needed to. Because something more important than names had been left behind. Permission. Permission to laugh without reason, to stop mid-step and smile at nothing, to breathe in silence without apology, to cry with laughter and laugh with grief. That was the true story. Not the one you could write down, but the one you could only live. A traveller once asked, what was their religion? The villagers looked at each other. They shrugged. And then one said, "Maybe the kind where you don't believe in anything," another added, "or maybe they believed in everything." But a child, eavesdropping near the well, chimed in, "I think they believed in the laugh before the words." That answer satisfied everyone, even the traveller, though he didn't understand why. Months passed. The fig tree by the well grew broader, its leaves thicker, its shade deeper. Beneath it, people now gathered when they were unsure, or scared, or full of feelings that had no name. Sometimes no one spoke, but someone always laughed, and when they did, it was enough. Because in that space, a laugh was not just sound, it was understanding. It was forgiveness, it was memory, it was a new beginning. One day, a letter arrived, folded into the shape of a crane. No name, no seal, just a message inside. There is a place where no one remembers how to smile. We are going there now. No one knew who sent it, but everyone knew what it meant. The monks were still walking, still laughing, still whispering healing into places that had forgotten how to sing. And that, perhaps, was the greatest part of their story. They never tried to be remembered, which is why they never could be forgotten. Whispered reflection to close chapter 3. What if you stopped trying to explain joy and just felt it? What if your story isn't in your name, but in the way someone remembers how they felt near you? What if your past isn't what matters, but what you bring into every room you enter? Maybe the monks weren't anyone special. Maybe they just remembered something we've all forgotten. And maybe you are remembering it too. Chapter 4, the North. Death comes laughing. To those who know how to laugh, even death becomes a companion. It was colder in the north. The sun did not rise as quickly here, nor did it linger. The wind came early and left late, dragging with it a silence that felt less sacred and more forgotten. The houses were fewer, the trees bent inward as if whispering secrets to themselves, and the people, tougher but not unkind, wore expressions like winter coats, thick, guarded, and a little too tight. When the 3 monks arrived, they did not laugh right away, not because they had forgotten how, but because the silence here wasn't ready for it. They did what they always did. They stood in the square, side by side, waited, smiled, laughed. But this time, their laughter was softer, like the slow breath of a man speaking into a cold room. No one joined them at first. No children gathered. No eyes twinkled. The villagers observed them like strange birds that had landed in the wrong season. By the 3rd day, it became clear. The oldest monk, whose eyes had always laughed before his mouth did, began to move slower. His cough came like a whisper at first, then stayed like an uninvited guest. He would pause mid-laugh, press his chest gently, smile, and nod. Still here, the gesture seemed to say. But his strength waned. The others did not panic. They only moved closer, walked more slowly, held his elbows when he stumbled, laughed gently into his silences as if to fill the spaces he no longer could. It was on the seventh day that he lay down beneath a tall cedar tree just beyond the edge of the village. He folded his hands across his chest, turned his face to the sky and smiled. The villagers gathered at a distance, not to watch, but because they felt something was ending, or perhaps beginning. The 2 remaining monks knelt beside him, one on each side. No tears, no panic, no prayers, only breath, only presence. And then he laughed. A single, full-bodied sound that startled the wind and made a bird rise from the cedar's branches. It wasn't forced, it wasn't weak. It was the kind of laugh that held everything inside it. Every moment he'd lived, every sorrow he'd shed, every joke the universe had played on him. It rang across the trees like a bell that could not be unrung. Then he exhaled and did not inhale again. Just like that, he was gone, smiling. Still. A long silence followed. The villagers did not know what to do. They expected grief, expected weeping, expected ceremony. But instead, the 2 monks beside him looked at one another and began to laugh, louder than before, freer, deeper. One clapped his hands, the other stomped the ground in a rhythm that sounded like a child's dance. And the villagers, who had once watched them as strangers, now looked on not with confusion, but awe. "How can they laugh?" a mother whispered. A child near her answered, "Maybe because he told them to." Later that evening, the villagers approached the 2 remaining monks and offered them black cloth incense, a burial plot on the hill. They refused it all, kindly, firmly. The elder monk shook his head and drew a circle in the dirt. Then inside it he placed a single twig. He tapped it twice, smiled and pointed to the sky. The villagers didn't understand, until Jun, the shoemaker, stepped forward and said, "He told me once, 'When I die, burn me as I am, don't dress me, don't clean me, the world never made me dirty.'" Gasps. A few shuddered at the thought, but the monks nodded. They lifted their companion's body gently, robes unchanged, sandals still dusty, hair still scattered with leaves, and they carried him, not to a tomb, not to a grave, but to a pyre. It was built from cedar and fig wood, dry reeds, and the twigs he had once used to poke at the fire when laughing with children. They laid him on it with care, folded his arms across his chest, set a single orange flower at his feet, and then stepped back. A silence fell, not out of fear but respect. One of the monks struck the flame, touched it to the base of the pyre. The fire rose, steady, soft, and then a sound, a sharp pop, then another, then a burst of colour. Fireworks, hidden in the folds of the dead monk's robe, crackling gold, leaping green, echoing red. The villagers gasped, then laughed, then cried. One boy fell to the ground, clutching his sides from laughter. A woman held her hands to her heart as tears rolled down her face. They understood. The flames burned slowly through the night. No one left, no one spoke much. A few whispered memories, a few offered food. Most simply watched the fire and listened to the echoes of laughter still dancing between the trees. The fireworks had ended, but something else remained. A warmth, a clarity, the kind of silence that doesn't ask for noise. The next morning, where the ashes had settled, someone found a small stone, flat, smooth, still warm, and carved into it, not by chisel but fire itself, was a single symbol, a circle, open at the top. The villagers took it as a sign, not of religion, not of magic, but of continuation. He's not gone, June said. He just laughed his way forward. The two monks remained for one more day. They sat beneath the cedar tree, sometimes smiling, sometimes completely still. People brought them bread, fruit, letters they would never read. One child gave them a drawing, 3 orange-robed figures holding hands with the sun. They bowed, and when morning came they walked, not south, not east, but deeper into the north, toward colder lands, toward people who perhaps needed joy even more. No one chased them, but the village followed in another way. That winter, they told stories not just around fires, but within them. They shared laughter like seeds, planting joy in places where grief once grew. And sometimes late at night, they would sit alone and laugh, for no reason at all. Maybe death is not a door. Maybe it's the punchline of a life well told. And maybe if we learn to laugh through the endings, we discover they're not endings at all. Chapter 5. The Body. A funeral of joy. The way we die reveals how we lived. The smoke still lingered, not just in the sky, but in their bones. That morning the village was unusually quiet, not out of mourning, but reverence. No bells were rung, no ceremonies declared, and yet everyone knew what needed to be done. The villagers began to gather wood, not the finest, not the strongest, but the kind that made good flame: cedar, fig, old pine. They laid it carefully beneath the same cedar tree where the monk had passed, as if the land itself had already chosen Chode's spot. Jun brought a worn blanket to drape over the monk's body, but the elder monk gently stopped him. No, with touching the man's arm. He said, the world never dirtied him. Let him burn as he lived. Jun lowered the blanket. The body remained as it was, robes slightly wrinkled, bare feet dusted from the road, smile soft on his face. It was not disrespect, it was devotion, and the villagers began to understand. By afternoon, the pyre was ready, not high, not grand, simple, just enough to carry him upward. Children placed orange flowers between the wood. Women left small handfuls of rice and dates near his feet. Men stood still, hats pressed to chests, eyes quiet. No one tried to lead, no one tried to speak, they simply circled him in presence. The monks sat nearby, hands in their laps, eyes on the sky, not blinking, until one of them rose. With calm hands, he touched the flame to the edge of the pyre. The fire caught slowly. It crackled like soft laughter in the cold. Then, boom! A shock of light, blue, gold, orange, shot from beneath the monk's folded robe. Then another. Then 3 more in succession. Crackling bursts spiraled upward, painting the sky in laughter's colours. The villagers gasped. A child screamed, then laughed. A man dropped to his knees, hands in the air, as sparks danced across the canopy. An old woman covered her mouth with both hands, then began to giggle through her fingers. The flames roared, the fireworks soared, and above it all, still burning, still smiling, was the monk, wrapped not in shrouds, but in joy. Then the real miracle happened. Laughter. It rose from the crowd, not nervously, not out of confusion, but from the core, deep from bellies and bones, the kind that shakes ribs, the kind that turns tears into music. It rippled through the square like a wave of release. They laughed for the man. They laughed for themselves. They laughed for every loved one they had ever buried in silence. And it was not inappropriate. It was sacred, a funeral of joy. As the fire softened to embers, the two remaining monks stood. They did not speak. They simply placed their hands together in a bow, slow, deep, with gratitude that said everything words never could. Then they turned and walked away. No final chant, no farewell blessing, just the soft sound of their sandals on dirt, and the wind carrying the last crackle of joy behind them. A child tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Will they come back?" The mother knelt beside her. "Maybe not like before," she said, "but they never really leave." The girl nodded as if she understood something far beyond her years, and for a moment the air felt full, not with ash, not with grief, but with something holy. That night, the villagers sat around the fire, not the funeral fire, but a new one, born from its embers. Someone sang, someone danced. Ready for the next section? Please share the text you'd like me to repeat. It was as if joy had become a language they'd always known, but only recently remembered how to speak. The baker, old Suri, began offering sweet rolls for free on Wednesdays. When asked why, she said, "Because today I feel lighter." The children invented a new game. They called it the silent smile. The rules were simple. Stand in front of someone, say nothing, smile. Whoever laughs first loses or wins, depending on how you look at it. A boy named Tao made straw dolls, 3 of them, tied with orange thread and bits of cloth. He carried them on his shoulder and said they helped him remember not to get too serious. When a neighbour scolded him for laughing at a falling leaf, Tao smiled and said they would have laughed too. No one argued. One morning, the village woke to find the wall behind the square painted, not with names, not with saints, but with a single phrase written in sweeping orange letters. We laughed, therefore we lived. No one admitted to writing it, but no one removed it either. It stayed, through rain, through market days, through births and goodbyes. Somehow it always looked fresh. Visitors from neighbouring towns began to arrive. They had heard about the monks, about the funeral, about the laughter. They came curious, left changed. Some tried to copy the monks' ways. Some just sat on the bench. Some cried without knowing why. But all left lighter. As for the monks, no one knew where they'd gone. The road north was long and the woods were deep, but sometimes, just sometimes, on windy afternoons, or when dusk settled a little too gently, someone would stop mid-step, turn their ear, and say softly, "Did you hear that?" A laugh, soft, somewhere between leaf and wind. Whispered ending, Chapter 6. Laughter does not die. It travels like breath, like wind, like love. You may not see them again, but if you listen with your heart, you'll hear them everywhere. Chapter 7. A whisper to the listener. You are not just hearing the story. You are part of it. How long has it been since you laughed for no reason? Not because something was clever, not because someone told a joke, but because something inside you felt light. Like a bird stretching its wings, like wind playing with leaves, like your chest suddenly remembering it had room to breathe. Maybe it's been a while. Maybe you forgot how. That's okay. Let's begin again. Right here. Right now. Just you and this moment. Begin soft forest amp, distant breeze, the murmur of leaves. Close your eyes. Let the world go dim behind your lids. Feel the weight of your body, your feet, your hands, your shoulders. Let them soften. Now take a breath. Not a perfect one, just enough. Inhale. Feel the air touch something inside you that you've ignored. Exhale. Let go of whatever came with you today. Picture yourself in that village, the one where laughter lives in the air, where firewood carries memory, where benches remember your name even if no one else does. Feel the dust beneath your feet, the warmth of an afternoon sun, the quiet smile of someone watching you, not to judge but to welcome. Now, breathe again. Inhale a smile. Exhale the weight. Now bring your attention to your chest. Feel it rise and fall. That gentle rhythm, it has always been with you. Through every grief, through every joy, through every silent morning you thought no one noticed. Let it hold you now. Bring to mind something you've been carrying. Not to solve it, Not to fix it, just to see it. Maybe it's sorrow, maybe shame, maybe nothing with a name, just a heaviness. Let it sit beside you. All set? Let me know if there's another section to repeat.